In 2016, one country did something no nation on earth had bothered to do before. It wrote drinking water into its constitution, a right no company, no drought, no government could ever take away. That sounds like activism. It isn't. It's just how this country has always treated nature, not as scenery to admire through a bus window, but as the actual foundation the whole state stands on. This is Slovenia. Barely 2 million people, smaller than New Jersey, and somehow sitting directly on top of 4 completely different kinds of ground at once. The Alps in the north, the Mediterranean in the south, the flat wheat fields of Pannonia in the east, and in between, a plateau so strange it gave the entire world a word: karst. Most countries squeezed between that many extremes spend their whole existence just trying to survive the collision. Slovenia didn't survive it. Slovenia outthought it. Picture what that actually requires for a second. You'd need one set of habits for glacier-carved mountains, a completely different set for a coastline, another for flat farmland that floods, and a fourth for ground that behaves like it has its own private plumbing system underneath your feet. Most countries would pick one relationship with nature and force the rest of the territory to live with it. Slovenia let each region answer to its own ground on its own terms, and then, centuries later, wrote the same underlying respect into national law. Start with the ground itself, because in Slovenia, the ground doesn't behave. Rain falls, and instead of running off into rivers the way it does almost everywhere else, it disappears straight into the limestone. Centuries of water have dissolved the rock from below, carving out an entire second country underground. Caves, tunnels, chambers, rivers that run for kilometers without ever seeing daylight. The region responsible for all of it is called karst. Say it out loud and you'll recognize it instantly, because geologists everywhere borrowed the name. Every sinkhole region on the planet, from Vietnam to Kentucky, is technically karst ground, named after this one plateau in southwestern Slovenia. A small nation quietly renamed a geological phenomenon after itself, and the rest of the world just went along with it. And instead of treating that underground maze as something to seal off and avoid, Slovenians started walking tourists through it before most of the world even had electric light. At Postojna, a narrow-gauge train has carried visitors into the cave system since the 1870s, one of the oldest cave tourism operations anywhere on the planet, running through passages that are still actively being carved by the same water today as they were a century and a half ago. But naming the ground is the easy part. Living on top of it is another matter. Take Lake Cerknica, a few hours from the capital. Most of the year it's a real lake. Boats out on the water, fishermen working the shallows, reeds thick along the shore, birds nesting in them by the thousands. But every summer, the water drains straight back out through the same limestone sinkholes that formed it in the first place. And within weeks, the lake floor turns into pasture. Farmers move their cattle in and let them graze where boats were floating only months earlier. Then autumn comes. The water rises back up through the same holes from somewhere underground. And the whole cycle repeats, has repeated, on record, for centuries. Closely enough that people here can more or less predict the calendar by it. Locals didn't fight a lake that refuses to stay put. They built 2 entirely different economies on the same patch of ground and just switched between them on schedule, the way anyone else would switch between a summer job and a winter one. Further below ground, at Škocjan, an entire river vanishes into a canyon so large it's counted among the biggest known underground canyons on the planet. The Reka River runs on the surface for a while, then drops out of sight into the rock and keeps flowing for kilometers in total darkness before it resurfaces somewhere else, as if the country has a second river system running beneath the one you can actually see. And in that darkness lives something that, for centuries, nobody could explain. A pale, blind creature that can go years without eating and can live past the century mark in total darkness. When floods occasionally washed one out of the caves and onto the surface, the people who found it had no biology to explain it with. So for a long time, they explained it the only way that made sense to them. It had to be a baby dragon, washed up from whatever slept in the rock below. What do you think this creature actually turns out to be? Drop your real guess in the comments before you keep watching, because it isn't a dragon, and the real answer is almost stranger than the legend. That creature, by the way, is properly called an olm, a real, still-living cave salamander, no dragon required, and somehow stranger than the legend it replaced. Because here's what's strange. None of that should have produced anything but hardship. A country whose ground swallows lakes, hides rivers, and grows creatures nobody understood should have stayed a country of people permanently on guard against the earth beneath their feet. Instead, Slovenians did something almost nobody does when nature refuses to cooperate. They built around the refusal instead of fighting it. Predjama Castle is the clearest proof. Built directly into the mouth of a cave, halfway up a cliff face, it isn't decorating the rock, it's using it. As the story goes, the knight who held it, a robber baron named Erazem, was besieged for months by a Habsburg army camped below, waiting him out and expecting him to starve within weeks. Instead, secret tunnels behind the castle connected to the cave system and let his men slip out at night for fresh supplies. The story goes that he even had cherries sent out to taunt the army during the siege, as if the mountain itself were feeding him. The cave that should have been a trap became his exit route, and it took betrayal from inside the walls, not the siege itself, to finally bring him down. Then there's the rain problem. Slovenia's climate is wet enough that hay left out to dry the normal way just rots before it's ready. Instead of giving up on hay, someone built a structure that exists almost nowhere else on the planet, the kozelik, a freestanding wooden rack designed to let wind move through drying hay while keeping the worst of the rain off it. It's furniture, built out of an argument with the weather. Drive through the countryside today, and you'll still see them standing in the fields, doing the exact job they were built for 2 centuries ago. The capital itself carries the same instinct written into its skyline. In 1895, an earthquake leveled much of old Ljubljana. Churches cracked, buildings collapsed, whole streets came down. But instead of rebuilding it the way it had always looked, the city used the disaster as a clean slate and rebuilt in the Art Nouveau style, sweeping through Europe at the time. The pastel, curved, ornamented buildings tourists photograph along the river today only exist because an earthquake forced the question in the first place. The catastrophe didn't just get repaired, it got redesigned into an identity. The capital hasn't let go of that old dragon legend either. In fact, it put the creature directly on the city's own coat of arms and cast 4 bronze dragons onto one of its most recognizable bridges, standing guard over the same river that still occasionally behaves like the karst everywhere else in the country, rising, falling, sometimes running low enough in a dry stretch to look like it's disappearing on its own schedule too. The pattern holds even in the smallest things. Slovenia is one of the most heavily forested countries in Europe, and instead of treating that as scenery, generations of households have run their heating, their building, and their local economies directly off sustainably managed woodland, cutting only what regrows, because a forest that thick isn't a backdrop here, it's infrastructure. At Idrija, in the west, the same instinct shows up underground in a completely different way. The town grew around what became one of the largest mercury mines on the planet, an industry dangerous enough that it shaped the town's entire rhythm of life for generations. But while the men went down into that mine, the women above ground turned, waiting hours, into an entire lace-making tradition, taught mother to daughter, until it became a formal craft with its own dedicated school, still training new lace-makers today, and now recognized internationally as a craft worth actively protecting. A mining town that could have been defined purely by what it dug out of the ground ended up equally known for something delicate that was woven by hand, not mined. And then there are the bees. In the same countryside, a specific gray and gold bee, the Carniolan honeybee, became so central to how this small country farms and feeds itself that a Slovenian beekeeper named Anton Janša was eventually brought to Vienna to teach beekeeping directly to the Habsburg imperial court, at a time when almost nobody treated the subject as a real science. He's still credited today as one of the founders of modern beekeeping practice. That local tradition never faded the way it did in most of Europe. Slovenia still has one of the highest concentrations of beekeepers per person on the continent, and it eventually convinced the United Nations to make a global holiday out of it. World Bee Day, held every year on May 20th, exists because one small alpine country refused to let something as fragile as a pollinator become an afterthought. Even the wine follows the rule. In the hill country along the western border, in Goriška Brda and the Vipava Valley, slopes too steep for normal farming got carved into narrow terraces by hand, one retaining wall at a time, because flat vineyard land simply doesn't exist in that part of the country, and nobody was willing to give up on wine because of it. Generations later, those same terraces are still worked mostly by hand, because machinery can't manage the angle the original builders were stuck with. The limitation never went away. It just got absorbed into how the wine is actually made, vintage after vintage. None of this reads like survival. It reads like negotiation. A country sitting down across the table from its own geography and hammering out terms instead of just enduring whatever nature decided to do that year. Which brings us back to that constitution. In 2016, when Slovenia made drinking water an untouchable right, it wasn't a new instinct. It was centuries of built habit finally written down as law. Around the same time, the capital banned cars from its historic core entirely, turned its riverside into pedestrian space, and was named Europe's green capital for it. Not because a mayor wanted good press, but because keeping the water, the forest, and the air usable had already been the actual job of running this country for longer than anyone could remember. But mastering nature isn't the same as hiding from it, and Slovenia never tried to hide. The Julian Alps rise in the north, crowned by Triglav, the mountain so central to the national identity that its outline sits on the flag itself. Below the peaks, the Socha River runs a color that only Slovenia's rivers seem to manage, an impossible turquoise that looks artificial even standing right next to it, fed by glacial melt and limestone runoff working together instead of against each other. Cutting straight through those same mountains is the Vršič Pass, over 50 hairpin bends carved into solid rock by hand, during the First World War, by prisoners of war forced to build a supply route under threat of the front line just beyond the ridge. In the winter of 1916, an avalanche buried a section of the road and killed dozens of the men who had built it with their own hands. A small wooden chapel, still known today as the Russian Chapel, stands at the site, put up by the surviving prisoners for the ones who didn't make it down. One of the only monuments in the country built directly by the people who lost someone to the mountain itself. That's the low point of this story, the one moment where the mountains actually won. But that same brutal road is exactly the one thousands of drivers and cyclists choose every summer, precisely because the mountains that killed the men who built it are now some of the most carefully engineered alpine roads in Europe. The danger didn't disappear. It got mapped, reinforced, and opened to anyone willing to drive it. If you want to see exactly how a country turns a road built on tragedy into one of the most driven mountain passes on the continent, that story is still coming. So make sure you're subscribed before it does. Down at the coast in Sachovlia and Piran, families have harvested sea salt using almost the exact same method for roughly 700 years, flooding shallow pools, letting the sun and wind do most of the work, then hand-raking the crystals off a thin living layer of clay and algae that the workers themselves maintain, generation after generation, entirely by hand, no machinery involved, because that layer is what gives the salt its particular character, and losing it would mean losing the whole method. Inland, at Lipica, the same patience shows up in horses instead of salt. A stud farm operating since the late 1500s, breeding the white Lipizzaner horses now used in classical riding schools across Europe. From bloodlines that have barely changed in 400 years, still trained using techniques that would look familiar to the people who started the program. Even the way Slovenians relate to their own mountains follows the same rule instead of breaking it. Climbing Triglav, the country's highest peak, isn't treated as an extreme sport reserved for a few. It's closer to a shared cultural expectation, something a large share of the population is quietly encouraged to do at least once in their life. Guided routes and mountain huts built specifically to make a genuinely difficult alpine peak accessible to ordinary people, instead of walling it off as expert-only territory. Every one of these, the salt pans, the horses, the hay racks, the lace, the bees, the forest, the water law, is the same instinct wearing a different costume. Don't fight the ground. Don't ignore the ground. Sit with it long enough to learn its rules, then build your entire way of life around obeying them better than the ground itself expects you to. Indonesia, on the other side of the planet, survived its geography by daring it, building temples on live volcanoes, learning to live inside the blast radius, turning catastrophe into pilgrimage after the fact. Slovenia took the opposite road to the same kind of victory. It never had to dare anything. It just paid attention, for long enough, that the ground stopped being a threat and became the plan. That's the real difference between a country that survives its geography and one that masters it. Survival is what happens when you have no choice, when the volcano is going to erupt whether you're ready or not, and all that's left is to build meaning out of the aftermath. Mastery is slower and far less dramatic. It's what happens when you had decades, sometimes centuries, of small chances to lose to the ground beneath your feet. And instead of losing, or fleeing, or simply enduring it, you kept negotiating. One lake, one cave, one hillside, one law at a time, until the terms were entirely on your side. Nobody films the exact moment mastery happens, because there isn't one. It's a few hundred years of decisions that all point the same direction, and Slovenia is what that looks like once it's finished. There's something almost humbling about a country this small, refusing to lose to its own ground, because most of us have some version of that ground in our own lives, the stubborn problem we've spent years just enduring, instead of actually sitting down to learn its rules. Slovenia's answer was a constitution, a chapel, a hay rack, and a bee's own holiday. If you want to see what a country twice as unlikely as this one, built out of an entire ocean instead of a cave system, hit subscribe so you don't miss it.